Good morning, everyone. You are at the panel called Rewriting the World in this wonderful festival, Palestine Writes. First of all, an amazing thank you to the organizers for what has been really an incredible event so far, an incredible few days. My name is Neferti Tadiar. I'm a professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at Barnard College at Columbia University. And I'm very pleased and honored to be moderating this discussion with two amazing writers. Let me just get because I would like to introduce them, Natalie Handal and Sheldon Patel. But before I introduce everyone, I realize that we want to wait a little bit until we have, before we start, just to make space for people to come in. I did have just a couple logistical things to say, which is that if you would like to write about this or tweet or put anything on social media, please use the hashtag Palestine Writes. And secondly, we are doing interpretation in Arabic, and if you would like to listen to this panel in Arabic, please click the globe below where it says interpretation so that you can get the simultaneous interpretation. Okay, it's wonderful. Everybody is coming in so quickly. Okay. All right, why don't I go ahead and introduce our wonderful panelists. Again, this is the panel for Rewriting the World. And our speakers today, our panelists, are Natalie Handal and Sheldon Patel. So let me just introduce Natalie first. Natalie Handal is from Bethlehem, Palestine. She was raised in Latin America, France, and the Middle East. Educated in Asia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Claire Messoud writes, quote, "A contemporary Orpheus, she hymns our most urgent and ineffable truths," close quote. Her most recent book include Life in a Country album, 2019, the Flash collection, The Republics, winner of the Virginia Faulkner Award for Excellence in Writing, and the Arab American Book Award, the critically acclaimed poet in Andalusia, and Love and Strange Horses, winner of the Gold Medal Independent Publisher Book Award. Handal is the recipient of awards from the Lannan Foundation, Centro Andaluz de las Letras, Fondazione de Venezia, among others. She is a professor at Columbia University and writes the column The City and the Writer for Words Without Borders. So welcome, Natalie.
Thank you so much.
And Shailja. Kenyan activist Sheldra Patel is the author of Migritude, a #1 Amazon poetry bestseller, currently taught in over 100 colleges and universities worldwide. Her poems have been translated into 17 languages. Honors include a Sundance Theater Fellowship, a Voices of Our Nations Poetry Award, the Fanny Ann Eddy Poetry Award, the Nordic Africa Institute African Writer Fellowship, and Josie Book Fair Guest Writer Award. Patel is a founding member of Kenyans for Peace, Truth and Justice, a civil society coalition which works for an equitable democracy in Kenya. The African Women's Development Fund named her one of 50 inspirational African feminists. She is currently a research associate at the Five Colleges Women's Studies Research Center in Western Massachusetts. So thank you for joining us, Shailja. Very pleased and honored to have you here.
I'm so happy to be here.
Okay, so let me just start off with a question that I see that I feel comes up in both of your work. You know, both of you write on themes of belonging, not belonging, as shaped by dominant nationalist, territorial, and masculinist orders or borders. I want to make / orders. I would love to hear your thoughts on how your movements between and across borders have shaped your understanding of belonging, and how those thoughts have changed for you across the years. Would you care to go ahead, Sheldra?
Greetings, everybody. I'm so happy to be here, and I want to acknowledge the Indigenous inhabitants of all the lands and territories that everybody is logging in from all over the world. It's incredible to feel a part of this global convening. I'm speaking to you today from Nonotuck land in the Quinnetequac Valley. Our neighboring Indigenous nations are the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan and the Pequot to the west, the Abenaki to the south, and the Mohican to the north. I also want to acknowledge and thank our translators today. We have Haifa from Ramallah, and Haifa and Arsen are in Jerusalem, and our amazing tech support, Nur, is in Ramallah. So we're supported by all these people that you can't see who are making this possible. So this question about borders has a special relevance for me because I'm in quarantine right now. So I'm in the space where my household is quarantining from the world outside our house, our homestead. And I'm also in quarantine within the house from my housemates. So we're doing this delicate dance of preserving and reifying borders for our mutual survival and our collective health, while also trying to extend care and practice care across these borders. And so I start this conversation with myself, with the borders of my own body, and what does it mean to be displaced from our own bodies? What does it mean to be in borders that exist for our protection when so much of my theorizing and practice and work in my life has been about dissolving borders and about defining borders as violence? Yet we're at a time now when borders really, in many ways, are necessary for our collective well-being and for our collective survival. And I'm coming to the words of Craig Santos Perez, who said, "First return stolen land, second native people determine immigration policy." And that feels to me like a very good starting point for a conversation about borders in this time, because we're seeing it played out in real time in the US, certainly. We're seeing sovereign native nations actually close their borders to outsiders in order to protect their very vulnerable populations, and experience of violence against their borders from the settler colonial state. I'm thinking of the Cheyenne Sioux people in South Dakota who have implemented a policy of checkpoints around the reservation in order to protect their people who are experiencing COVID at exponentially higher rates than anybody else in South Dakota. And as we know, if South Dakota was a nation, it would now be the nation in the world with the highest rate of COVID deaths and COVID infection. And the state is refusing to respect those borders and literally imposing punitive measures on the Sioux Nation for simply practicing protective bordering. So it's really a potent time for us to think about not just borders as violence, because the politics of borders as violence that all of us who are radical internationalists and who believe in the free movements of people we've had that discourse for a while, but we're now in a time where we really need to think about who gets to define borders and on behalf of whom and for whose protection, and what happens when the settler colonial state violates our borders in order to annihilate us. I would love to hear from Natalie.
Yes, so, this big question, belonging and borders, obviously I'm Palestinian, so I was almost, I was born in borders. First, I'm from Bethlehem, so just the border with Jerusalem that was cut off from me as sister cities. But growing up, as a Palestinian, I didn't exist. And then later on, when I became multiple, I was too multiple to belong anywhere. So belonging has always been that question. And I came from a deeply rooted Bethlehemite family. So I knew exactly where I belonged. So personally, in that intimate space and growing up, I was very aware. But as my migration, I have a very big migration that existed within Latin America and Europe and North America. And in every context, I had to converse with my Palestinianness and my Bethlehemness in very different ways. I think one of the key moments in Palestinian identity for me, and of course, I think for other Palestinians who were of my generation, when the 1987 Intifada started, I was at university in Boston. And that was a really big moment because this is the first time that I would hear the word Palestine in a bigger context, outside, because we couldn't say the word Palestinian. I would be in a classroom and I could not use that word. I wasn't able to use that word till much later. So to hear it in 1987, it was a very important moment. And of course, that first Intifada was important in relationship to belonging. But one of also the important things was my family in Bethlehem, my cousins who were of the same generation. It was the first time that I actually had conversations with them where they, who had been raised inside Palestine and Bethlehem, they had been raised without any books that spoke about Palestine. So when one of my cousins went to Montpellier to study from Bethlehem, he was at the library trying to read every book there was on Palestine. And this is when I started to become conscious of how we existed as the very experience, a very vast Palestinian experience, how we were scattered, not as Palestinian, not only able to converse with each other as, at that time, of course. And then later on, I would say many things happened, as we know, but after 9/11, and 9/11 changed everything in relationship to that, because it became a moment where the world really had to speak to the Arab world, to the Muslim world, to what it means to who we are, to be acknowledged of the region, and also to see us. If you are speaking in an American context, we had to finally become visible, right? And I remember when Hani Abu Assad's film, Paradise Now, I remember I was at the cinema and I was waiting for this other film, I can't remember what it was. And there was the trailer for Hani Abu Assad's film. And the trailer, they would just show you the streets of Palestine. And then they said, this spring, I think it was spring, welcome to the streets of Palestine. And I remember being at that cinema. It was 2005, I think, I can't remember exactly. And it was the first time in my adult life that I had experienced Palestine in a open context like that, and at that moment, I knew that things were going to change. Today, when I was at university, I was forbidden to use the word. In fact, I was almost kicked out of the communication department. It was Ibrahim Abulukhud that helped me. And now I teach at Columbia, and I teach the Arab diaspora and Palestine in a context, and the students are incredibly versed. In the last 17 years, the students today are incredibly versed as to the region and as to what Palestine is. So for me today, as a Palestinian who is also American, who is also Latin American, who is also European in that way, I can acknowledge all those parts, and I don't really have a conflict of multiplicity per se, but I can acknowledge belonging to all these different places. But what is important also to acknowledge is that the reason I have sort of acquired all these things was that I was displaced. And that is the most important thing to acknowledge before, so that when I'm told that, oh, you're not Palestinian enough, or you're not this enough. Well, yes, but there is also the fact that I'm forbidden to go back to this place, right? This, which is my homeland. That all these things have to be also, we have to accompany that in our discussion of, what it means to belong and so forth. And so I'll stop here. I'll stop there.
No, thank you. Both of these thoughts, they mean a lot to me as well, because I think that, not having grown up in the U.S. and having moved here when I was an adult, right? You carry a lot from other places, and so that there are all sorts of borders that are not just about the territorial borders, and it does complicate and challenge the notion of belonging, right? Where you can create belonging. So I want to acknowledge what Sheldra said about the way that borders, the changing meaning of what borders are, where borders are not just violence, but also the possibility of creating sovereignty, creating self-determination, creating a sense of place, right? That there are contours, that there are places, that there's the possibility of creating some form of belonging does require not exactly borders. I don't know if we would call it borders, Sheldra, but I would like to get your thoughts on the way that we can hold these two things together. The fact that borders are imposed, people are displaced, as in what just Natalie just said. But also what's so powerful in both of your works is the forms of belonging that you continue to articulate, to sound out, right? That doesn't get destroyed or that becomes renewed. And you do that specifically through language. I just want to read to Nathalie in an interview, Natalie, which you shared with us. You say, "Every time I cross language, the border loses some of its power. Every time I allow myself to desire, to partake in pleasure, I claim existence. Eroticism is an act of resistance." So I wanted to just hear a little bit about this crossing of languages that you, abundantly, gloriously display in Life in a Country album. And I want to turn to Sheldra too, because she has a very moving meditation on language in Dreaming in Gujarati, in Migritude, where Sheldra, you depict scenes of beckoning, taunting, mocking, reprimand, and then you write, 12, I tunnel into books, forge an armor of English words. And you show the capacity of language to be both the weapon, the power, the site of, the place of violence, and yet you forge an armor in English. So this is just a way of asking you to reflect a little bit on your relations to language in relationship to this idea of movement and borders.
Natalie, would you like to go first?
Okay, there was a lot. So
I know there was a lot. Just so that was a lot. But Natalie, the part that I quoted was when you said that every time I cross language, the border loses some of its power.
Yes. So I want to, as Palestinians, the fact that the idea of pleasure, and by that I mean that we are always looked at as, we are always spoken about. Our humanity is never addressed you know, as if we weren't pulsing beings with a heart that love, that have, you know, that experience everything, other things that people experience. You know, we dare to have pleasure. We dare. It's an act of resistance, you know, to live, to create, to do what we are doing, to be here in this festival, to create this. This is very powerful. And we were never given that space. So when we are told, oh, you know, when we are, you know, when there's this gaze on us that we can only do this, we haven't, you know, created, you know, certain things, you know, by this display right now, that holds a lot of power, you know. So, I think in relationship to language, you know, what's more powerful, you know, for me, the freedom that the most powerful freedom that I have experienced in my life is when I write a poem. That moment, no one can take away from me. And the stories that we write and the poems that we leave behind, this continues. This is really such an incredible act of resistance, I think. And I grew up, my language, my native language, when, you know, we speak about, when I was growing up, I didn't have a native tongue, okay? Because I grew up with a symphony of languages. And, you know, in exile, and in deep migration, we kept speaking. I spoke 5 different languages, but all these different languages, I spoke them, but none of them were exactly mine. Even the English that I'm speaking, that I have come to write in, right? So I was at the border of all these languages all the time. I was constantly reminded of that border as well, right? But I knew where the Arabic lived in my body. I knew where all the other languages lived in my body as well, but they were still borders that I had to cross daily. It was it's like living constantly in this, it's in translation. You're constantly translating your own self, right? And you start, you start having to have this deep conversation with yourself and start having to redefine what it is, where it is you come from, and redefine what it is to be, for example, from a place like Bethlehem and from a place like Palestine. We have to rewrite and redefine that, not be told that to be this, it's like that or like this. No, actually, no. This experience that we have that is dispersed and scattered will create different ways of being a Bethlehemite and different ways of being Palestinian. And all of them are valid, and together, it's a very, very, very powerful and beautiful tapestry.
Thank you. Sheldra, your reflections.
Wow, I feel like every time Natalie speaks, I want 10 minutes to just sit and digest everything that she said. But I heard a 2-part question from you. The first was, how do we redefine borders in a way that is not carceral, that is not violent, that is not imposed by an outside project whose goal is colonization? And the word that arose for me as I listened to you, Neferti, was boundaries. And the difference between borders and boundaries is, to me, consent, is relationships of care. Boundaries are defined by sovereign beings, sovereign communities, sovereign entities, and they are respected by those who have a relation of care to those within the boundaries and those who set the boundaries. You know, our Native American siblings have taught us the language of all our relatives. And that to me is such a powerful and important idea and practice, to be a good relative on the land on which you are a descendant of a settler or an arrivant or a visitor. What does it mean to be a good relative? What does it mean to welcome others as relatives? And how do we, if you are practicing consent and if you understand consent as the feminist affirmative consent, which is not just the absence of no, well, nobody pushed me away, so I can go onto this land, I can claim this territory, but as the presence of an informed and voiced and enthusiastic yes, an embrace, a welcome, then there is no dissonance between the practice of bordering, between boundaries and relationship. We can be in relationships of care across boundaries, and those boundaries are sustaining and affirming life and collective liberation. So I'm going to put that to one side. That was the borders and boundaries conversation. And then your question about language, and you referenced dreaming in Gujarati. My relationship and my thinking about language and the reclamation of language has grown in so much collective thinking over the last few years. What it is important for me to put out there now is that while it continues to be incredibly important to reclaim the languages of our heritage, to reclaim and affirm native languages and create the infrastructures that sustain them and maintain them and expand the populations of their speakers, we've also seen in the last decade or so how easily even national languages and languages of the global south can be co-opted and weaponized by violent masculinities, by ethno-patriarchies for nationalist projects. I'm thinking of the way in which Hindu supremacy and the supremacy of Hindi as the national language of India, a country that has over 2,000 languages, has been imposed by the Modi government in its project of fascism and ethnic cleansing. And the way in Kenya, my own country, Kikuyu, has been imposed by a hegemonic ruling ethnicity as a language that defines Kenya. I'm thinking of the way even Kiswahili, one of the national languages of Kenya, is experienced as violence by surrounding nations of Kenya because they've been invaded by Swahili-speaking soldiers. So it's really important that we complicate our understanding of language and expand it to include sub-imperialisms and sub-colonialisms. So where I am now is really the place of language is as language does. Do we interrogate our language for the work that it is doing? Is our language doing the work of justice and of freedom? Or is it reifying another kind of dominance?
I'm so glad you raised the question of care, because it does bring together some of the things that you've both been saying, which is for us to try to disentangle belonging from territory, land from territory, and to see these places as relations of care rather than relations of control and imposition. Right. So I think that's very beautiful, and I actually do very much agree with you. And then the reason that I also think that it's just beautiful that you brought up care is because it does bring up the question of home and a feminist idea of home, which might be constituted through boundaries rather than borders, or identity as constituted through boundaries rather than borders. Like how we maintain forms of being that can flourish without these kinds of carceral logics or forms of captivity, or just these extractive fundamentalist ways of being. And so I wanted to return to the question of movement, because both of you have very beautiful incorporations of movement in the form of music and performance. And so I wanted you to reflect a little bit, or I wanted to hear a little bit about how your relations to, in the case of Natalie, it's Life in a Country album. I mean, it's structured like musical albums, and you ended with album mixed, and there's so many references in Life in a Country album to song and music, and you mentioned the Greek urban blues, you mentioned Orpheus, there's so many musical references. And in the case of Shailja, we know that migritude came from this performance. So I'm wondering about how it is that you think about this dance, right, between maintaining a sense of being that has integrity without it being a form of captivity in an imposed identity, or as you rightly say Sheldra, all of these things that we like, language and borders that can be weaponized against us. They can be weaponized against the possibility of care and flourishing and belonging. So perhaps you could say a little something about your relations to as feminists, particularly as women. I think it's very important. This is a panel about women rewriting the world. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about your relationship as women and as feminists to rewriting the world through movement and performance and music in poetry.
Do you want to start? Go ahead.
Hey, wow. This goes back to so much work that I did and so many conversations and journeys of learning I had to go on when I conceptualized and created migritude as theater, as a staged piece of theater. Because first I had to overcome my own internal hierarchies. I was raised with this deep split between my embodied self and my cerebral self, and this terror of being visible in a way that could be sexualized. And that was to do with the idea of women as the carriers of culture and the containers of purity for a culture, as well as my nascent feminism really perceiving the incredible, the violence that the world does to women, which is that you can be a thinking woman or a feeling woman, but you can't be both. You can be a desired and desirable woman or a respected woman, but you can't be both. And so I had to break that down within myself and confront my own terror of even being a body on stage, and of moving on stage, of being sexual or physical or embodied on stage, because the fear was, if I move on stage in a way that is perceived as attractive, then my words no longer carry material weight. I will no longer be respected as a thinker. I will never be taken seriously as a political activist again. And it was extraordinary to see how deeply embedded that was for me on a cellular level. And then to understand the hierarchies of performance and of the arts, to experience over and over and over again the way that the arts are devalued as knowledge production, to be introduced at academic conferences as, we're going to have the panel and then we're going to have a poet entertain us. And having to speak up and say, no, I'm not here to entertain you. I'm here as an equal, as a producer of knowledge, as a theorist of my work. And you need to take my work seriously. You need to take art seriously as knowledge. The hierarchy between bodies that speak and bodies that move, seeing the ways in which dancers are so disrespected, devalued, and diminished in our society within capitalism, certainly, yet what they do is every bit as rigorous and demanding and complex as, what Olympic athletes do, or football players who are paid millions of dollars, or neurosurgeons. They train every bit as long as, a neurosurgeon or a college professor, and yet, when a dancer gets up on stage, people think it's fine to be talking while she's doing her extraordinary work. So all of that has really informed my feminist thinking around hierarchies of knowledge, around epistemologies, around women's bodies, and the embodiment of women's knowledge, and around the culture, around the way capitalism and patriarchy are deeply, deeply suspicious, if not violently hostile towards embodied knowledge, because embodied knowledge is so powerful and so dangerous and so feminist. It's necessarily feminist when your knowledge is fully integrated in an embodied self.
Mm. Well, she said everything No, but I'll add for me, just to add a note on music. And for me, music is an infinity. And that infinity is also, to me, feminine. It's in the bodies of women. It's women who have built my poems. It's through women that I have seen the world, their fierce voices that sing for me. I have gone back to women for my stories, for my way of building the world, for my way of seeing the world. And, and everything that you said, of course, but that infinity is so powerful because we cannot build an equal society without women, right? That's just not possible. So and the more visible and the more present we are, the more our voices are seen in all these different shapes, the more we are able to sing louder and more complex songs that reflect our world. So I'll end there. Thank you for that, by the way.
Yes, thank you both. Thank you both for that. I've been looking at the chat, and you're resonating with so many people. In fact, I just wanted to remind everybody that we are going to have a Q&A afterwards. So please do put your questions in the Q&A so that we can make sure to get to them. But your thoughts on embodiment and rebuilding the world, to go back to the overall theme of the panel of rebuilding, rewriting the world, rewriting what we think is knowledge, rewriting what we think is home. And here we are in Palestine Writes. How do we rewrite ourselves, for those of us who are not Palestinian, in relationship to Palestine? This has come up quite a bit. I mean, it also came up in Sheldra's work when, she quotes somebody saying that, how you're not even from Iraq. They're like, why are you crying for others? And I think there is something feminist about our ability to cry for others, these kinds of connections. And I wanted you to just, for Natalie, of course, your story of how you had to come back to and think about yourself as Palestinian after a period of displacement, perhaps alienation. We don't always know our own histories. So much of it is also just like returning to knowing our histories. But maybe some thoughts on how it is that we rewrite the world, how it is that you rewrite this world through connections with others. Something that really strikes me in both of your works is the voices of so many people in your work, the way that, you allow people's voices to come through in you, in your poetry, and, that it's not a single self that emerges. And that there is care for others. So perhaps maybe whatever you want to think about in terms of what would it mean for a feminist to rewrite the world, what are some of the things that would come to mind? And I know you're already doing that, I feel, but some thoughts.
Well, I think we focus all the time on differences, and I think thinking about the commonalities is really powerful. And in my experience, every place that I've been, in every space that I've been, I could relate to, I could be in a very poor neighborhood in Latin America or in the Caribbean in a completely different context than my own Bethlehem or Palestinian context, and relate to the experiences that I had there. And in that moment, we are all Palestinian, or we are all Mexican, or we are all Haitian, because we're experiencing that same pain of being whatever the experience might be at that moment, whether it is an experience of injustice, discrimination, whether it's an experience of being cast aside, poverty, being at a border, not being able to cross one place to another, not, we haven't, addressing issues, for example, of, who has the privilege of freedom, who has the privilege of having a paper that allows us to go from one place to another, okay? And as a woman, how does that change our gaze? And what is it that we offer that gaze, that stoplight, that border? How do we offer it? What do we discover by being a woman? How do we rewrite that experience? And as we're rewriting it, what is it that we're experiencing? I think all these insights are very important in what it says, what it can communicate about connectivity, collectivity, about love, about community, about being able to be in this, that what's happening in this country, where in Colombia, matters to what happens, is related to what's happening in Iraq. What's happening in India is connected to what's happening in Zimbabwe. What's happening in New York City is connected to what's happening in Argentina. We are connected in ways that we cannot avoid. And it's important for us to reach out to those voices. And I think really women do that in very beautiful, important ways. To one, listen, because the act of listening is an act of resistance, and connect, weave together those voices and those stories.
Yes, I would say, you are rewriting our threads of belonging to each other. And in my own work, it's not poetry, but it is, I feel that very strongly because, as a Filipina, and seeing the world from the Philippines and from the conditions that Filipino women face, but also seeing where we are in so many places. We care for so many people who are not our own. I feel that very strongly, that my task is also to make visible our belonging to each other, meaning not just Filipinas, but how Filipinas also belong to Palestine, how also belong to Kenya. I haven't done that yet, but to thread our belonging to each other. And I think that is a feminist act, to connect to each other. But it's kind of like a little bit like what Sheldra says, and I'll let you speak too, Sheldra, when you said, we learn from indigenous peoples that we are all relatives on the land. Well, perhaps we are relatives too, that we see each other as potentially relatives in this fight, relatives in freedom, relatives in care. But Sheldra, your own thoughts on feminist rewriting the world.
Well, I'll start with the internationalist understanding of solidarity with Palestine, particularly as it's located on the African continent. And I'm a member of Kenya Na Palestine, which is the Kenyan solidarity movement that organizes for and with Palestinians for Palestinian liberation. And it is a no-brainer that Israel is a colonial project, and we too were a colonized people. We understand what colonialism is. We see it. We can identify it immediately. It's really important to remember that South Africa's liberation movement has always been in solidarity with the Palestinian liberation movement. Desmond Tutu said, "Our liberation is incomplete without the liberation of the Palestinians." Nelson Mandela defined Israeli Zionist occupation as apartheid. We have that language, we have those frameworks, and we have that understanding on the African continent. And the reason that people are still having the debate on this continent about, well, why should Black people, why should African Americans be in solidarity with Palestinians? What have Palestinians ever done for us? Is ahistoric, and it is also deeply embedded in the insularity of US exceptionalism, a lack of understanding of Black histories outside the North American continent, a failure to understand colonialism and white supremacy as a global project, and to understand that Zionism is colonialism, Zionism is white supremacy, Zionism is apartheid. It was never in question in the US during the South African apartheid years, why should any person of conscience be in solidarity with the struggle against apartheid in South Africa? It was obvious why. But there's a particular way in which Zionists have so colonized the discourse, the educational system, through decades of very clear strategic thinking and campaigning around how to erase any real understanding of Zionism as apartheid, that people in the US and on the North American continent still struggle with an understanding of why Zionism is evil and why everybody on the planet should be in solidarity with Palestine. If we look at the present, there's also just a basic need to grasp that Israeli extractivism and Israeli militarism are a threat to the entire planet. Israel is the only nuclear power in the Middle East. It has a substantial nuclear arsenal that it regularly threatens other countries with. Israel is the largest manufacturer and buyer, one of the largest buyers of arms in the world, and it regularly sells weaponry to despotic regimes and repressive regimes around the world. The Israeli state is violent and deeply destructive in its global extractivism of minerals and resources in the service of its operations. And that has devastating consequences for South America, for Africa, for Asia. If we look at the future, the carceral Israeli state, the Zionist state, is aspirational for every repressive regime. It's what the Modi regime in India is trying to implement and is modeling itself on. It's what Uhuru Kenyatta's government in Kenya is using as a blueprint. It's what, US cops who are beating up and murdering Black people on the streets of the US train in Israel. They are using Israeli police and military techniques on domestic populations. So all of that is really important for people to grasp and understand and incorporate into their thinking around Palestinian solidarity. At its core, solidarity is never about benevolence. It is about our collective survival and our collective liberation.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for that, Sheldra. I'm so glad that you put the US in this also on the map here alongside Israel, because there is a lot to contend with here in the US that is not contended with. But I would like now to shift to looking at the time, to give both of you time to grace us with a reading of your work before we open up to Q&A. And there are many things going on in the chat and as well as in the Q&A, but I did want to have the chance to hear both of you read. your poetry so we can see this in action. Freedom in action, freedom in care, resistance for justice.
Requested one of my favorites from her Life in a Country album, which everybody can get.
Thank you so much. So, and thank you to both of you. Really, it's such an honor to be here with you. I'm going to read two poems, and I will begin with, since we have been speaking so much about migrations and refugees and borders. So this poem is entitled Europa Nostra. Now that we are guests in our bodies, how do we survive? Zainab operated a boat to be close to the 103 members of her family who drowned. Bassem learned to speak a language with another alphabet. Atek gathered feathers from trembling snow. Beckham carried splintered glass across 100 mountains. Bina stole prayers from forgotten bodies. Saba held the sound of drums as if they were breaths. Shinolo kept the sun in a folded leaf under a mattress. Roya kept the shadow of the Caspian Sea in the man who needed her. Mikolo dreamed the mystery turned cruel by another dream. Maybe the past is the beginning and return is staying absent. Meanwhile, when someone says, toughen up, look at them until they fade. And I will read this poem entitled Sculpting Time 7 Times, inspired by my city, Bethlehem, and the 7 quarters. I was born on a road in the sky. I was born to water and wells. I was born on a summer morning with my eyes filled with sea and my heart full of old windows. I was born under arcs that multiply time. I'm from those who walk through columns to recite hymns, those who record surahs in their dreams near and far. I'm from fishes and cloves, from the Dead Sea and the glory of angels. It doesn't matter where I was born, where I lived, where I went, or what I did. What matters is that time sculpted me 7 times in the eternity of the old city and saved me from those who tried to reinvent us. Thank you.
Thank you. It's beautiful. There's 2 of my favorite poems of yours. Sheldra.
Hey, you make me cry, Natalie. It's a successful day for a poet when you can make someone cry. I'm going to do a poem for you that is called What We Talk About When We Talk About Movement. How do you, the migrant, see us, the other? Asked the man last night after my talk in Venice. Guess the race of us. Guess the citizenship. What we talk about when we talk about freedom is the right to be seen, to be visible and normative, visible while safe, visible while unquestioned. How do I, who you construct as migrant, see you, who believe you belong here, you who think yourself stable in Venice, city of wedding cake palazzi, balanced on fast rising waters? I said, what I see is that white migrants to Kenya called themselves expatriates. Before, they called themselves settlers. I said, what I see is the painful smallness of your window on the world. Barely a slit in the wall, the scantest sliver of light. Enlarge your window, I said. Swing a sledgehammer through the brick. Make a jagged hole at least 200 years wide. See European migrants storm the borders of China, flood the country with opium. Swing the hammer again. Knock out another 200 years. Stand back from flying shards of masonry. Look over to your east. Watch white migrants, locusts in pith helmets, swarm over Asia. See the famished corpses, the vandalized temples in their wake. Look down. See the hungry hordes of Europe pile into rickety vessels, set sail south. See their scurvied bodies surge onto the African continent, hands outstretched, jaws in perpetual motion. Swing the hammer again. Wait for the dust to settle. You now have a panoramic view, 500 years in breadth. There are the boats, packed with ravenous European migrants, scrabbling the shores of North America. We won't speak of what follows. Citizen, you call yourself, denizen of the citadel, the fantasy of rooted nativity, the fiction that you live where you began. What I see when I look at you is ceaseless, torrential migration of your material effluvium, your mountains of disemboweled computers in Agboglashi, Ghana, your tsunami of discarded plastics in China, your bales of used clothing in Nairobi's Gikomba, your canisters of nuclear waste on the beaches of Somalia, your oil spills and pipeline flares across Ogoni land, your raging psychopath man-children raping girls from Afghanistan to Okinawa, your guns, your bombs, your tanks, your drones slicing the skies over Africa. What I see when I look at you are throngs of Italian child rapists on the streets of Malindi, tugging skinny 12-year-olds by the hands. You did ask. What we talk about when we talk about seeing is the size of the window, what direction it faces. What we talk about when we talk about migration is what moves and who is moved, by whose muscle. Where does it come to rest? What we talk about when we talk about talking is who defines and delineates. Where does their detritus go? Who is safe and who is ultimately free?
Thank you. Also beautiful. Well, we have Sheldra. There was. Were you going to read one more, or?
No, I think we should make some time for questions.
Okay, all right. So there have been a lot of questions here, and so I'm going to just read one. Natalie's words about belonging really resonate, especially for those of us who have lived a majority of our lives outside of Palestine in westernized communities and we're not academics. How can Palestinians come together, the millions in the diaspora, in a non-judgmental way rather than constantly comparing our solidarity to Palestine? The not Palestinian enough feeling is really disheartening because I have felt that too.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for this question. Who asked it?
It's anonymous.
Okay. Well, thank you for the question. I think this is a beautiful start, us being here. It's a powerful. We as Palestinians have not had the chance before to come together to have this conversation and to speak. This idea of comparing. I mean, first of all, there is no such thing as being more of something. That doesn't exist. You are who you are, and you don't need to justify that. I think the moment we give ourselves permission no longer to have to justify it, that becomes a really powerful thing. And finally, we aren't in it together. The more we can, in fact, what we need to do is listen to each other. I spoke earlier on the act of listening, know each other. I remember when, for instance, when I was growing up and I would say I was a Palestinian from Latin America, people didn't know where I was from. You know, they would say close to Cuba. It wasn't something that we knew. But today we are aware that in Central America, there's such a big diaspora in Chile. We have 500,000 Palestinian, an estimated 500,000 Palestine, the most outside of the Middle East. We are aware of the complexities of generation. That's very important to remember, that the generational experience. We have to become aware of the generational experience, of the geographical experiences, and what people what people lived in those places, and what makes them feel or not feel as connected. And most importantly, we have to stay open to each other and not close the door on anything. I think this is changing very much. I think it was about us not being aware of the vastness of who we are and of our experiences. And with writing, with as many of us as can be in the publishing scene, as many of us can publish, writing is so important, collecting our stories. This is where it is. This is where we learn about each other and create space for each other. So, and this is happening now, I think.
Although this question was asked to Natalie, I think, Shailja, that perhaps you might have something to say about it as well, because it is in some ways very resonant with diasporas. Especially, migrants, the condition of migritude that you say, how when people are saying that you are not enough of this or not enough of that, you're not enough of the identity, of the nation or country or land from which you were supposedly, originating from. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, what rises in my mind for me is Eduardo Galeano's words: "We are what we repeatedly do. Our identity resides in action and struggle." And Edward Said, who talked of identity, of experiencing himself as a confluence of currents, of many tides, rather than a fixed thing or, a fixed body in time and history and culture. And as a radical feminist internationalist, the question for me is always, who are we? Who am I in solidarity with? Who am I working with? Who am I thinking with? I experience myself collectively as a part of movements, as a part of struggles, as a part of the tides of history. I'm thinking of Dion Brand's beautiful words about shimmering awareness, alertness to the state of the world and what it means to be in conversation, because we are constantly growing and redefining ourselves. We do not, any of us, exist as a single insular atom. We exist in relation to each other. And the South African concept of Ubuntu is that we exist because others exist. We are because others are, and we are in relation to others. So that's where I locate myself in the discourse.
Well, this segues nicely, and I will just put two questions together, both questions about feminism and about woman as a category. The first is from Ayachi Anfal Media. How do you define a feminist critical thinking, and how important is it for us as third world women to reflect it in literature? I just want to add on another anonymous question because it's related. In praxis and pedagogy, how can we complicate the category woman as border or boundary? In what ways can we think about woman not as a category, but perhaps a condition, an orientation to the world that is not already framed, but a process or unframing? Do either of you want to take up either of those questions on feminism in writing or woman, the category of woman?
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about breaking down gender binaries and interrogating gender in every situation, recognizing gender as performance, recognizing gender as as a set of border practices, and always in every situation transcending binaries and thinking beyond the binary, because the binary does not ever serve, has never served the practice of liberation. It has never served queer people, it has never served non-binary people, it has never served marginalized people or women. And this goes back actually to the question of borders and how do we, one of the ways in which we make borders non-violent is also by queering them and by bringing a framework of queerness and a thinking of queer discourse to all the conversations that we're in. The other part of the question, how important is it for us as third world women to reflect critical feminism, I believe, in our literatures? I'm always resistant of prescribing what anyone should write or say, yes, we should, of course, put feminism into all our literature. I would say rather we should have, everybody in the world should be a feminist, because feminism is the practice of our collective liberation. Bell Hooks defined feminism as the dismantling of all relationships of unequal power. And the only people who don't want that are people who want to be oppressors. So feminist literatures come out of feminist thinking and feminist practice and feminist movements and working towards the world that we want to live in.
Yes, yes. And just the act of being here and of writing, and when you were constantly told that you couldn't do it, you couldn't write, couldn't publish, couldn't be in that space, you wouldn't find a place to belong, you wouldn't find that person interested in you, and that you persisted and you wrote that story and you wrote that poem and you went on stage and you were present. And that presence is the greatest act. I think that's what feminism is about. And feminism is everyone, right? It has no, everyone is and should be, a feminist, because this is where this is about being. This is about a certain type. This is about equality. This is about coming together in a sort of in the collectiveness that you have been speaking about. It's about it's about going against that power that is constantly trying to push us or divide us. Going back to that question on belonging, it's also about that. It's about all those acts of divisions, all that power. It's resisting that by saying, I'm here, I'm not going anywhere, and there you go.
Well, this perhaps segues into the next question. I mean, the idea of the divisions. This is from Tamoso Deep, who asks, where do you see the mainstream cultures or knowledge in the cultural hierarchy we are experiencing today? Because there are cultures facing erasures, from Kashmir, Palestine, and a few more places we do not know. In fact, some are criminalized and demonized as anti-modern. The Indian fascism feeds upon erasing Urdu, Muslim cultures raging down mosques, etc. We have Al-Aqsa in Palestine and Babri in Ayodhya. Would you like to share some words on it?
Oh. Wow. Could you just read the first couple of lines again? Because the question was in those lines.
Yes. Where do you see the mainstream cultures or knowledge in the cultural hierarchy we are experiencing today?
Well, mainstream cultures of knowledge are created and sustained by dominant powers. And the reason that we have colonialism, fascism, the erasure of certain groups of people around the world is in the service of power, specifically in the service of capitalist patriarchy. In India, the erasure of Kashmir and the ethnocide that is being committed on Kashmiris is in the service of the Indian state, which is modeling itself on the Israeli state. So our job is always to name it, to see it, to define it clearly, and then to oppose it with everything in our power.
I actually have there's another question specifically to Natalie. Should I read it?
Oh yeah, please.
Yes. Do we exist in language, within it, or in betweenness of languages? I have seen how identities were reinvented by languages and how they were appropriated. Coming back was never a choice. How can recovery happen to return to authenticity of selfhood?
Well, okay, that was. Could you read it? I don't know if it's about authenticity. I think we would have to define what authenticity is. I think authenticity, every one of us can defines our own authenticity. I don't think it's about others defining it for us. As writers, for example, we create our own languages. That's what writers do. And in creating that language, we are saying, this is who we are. And we're not allowing others to define who we are. We are defining ourselves, right? I don't know if you can add to that, Sheldra, but so it's not about living in sort of in betweenness or about having to be told or pushed, but it's about reinventing it and making the space for your own voice, leading the way for that voice and for those who's going to connect to that voice. So we are authentic to ourselves. Nobody can make us disauthentic.
Mm. What that brings to mind, Natalie, is one of your lines, which is, another of my favorite poems. Let me see if I can remember it. My country comes to me and says, compañera, I will always find you, no matter what language you are speaking.
Yes. Yes.
Very beautiful. Okay, so let me just take the last two questions and put them together. One is for a question for both of you. Since both of you reflected so beautifully on movements, languages, and hierarchy in politics of knowledge formation, there's so many powerful works in regional languages in the global South that are not recognized in the canon. And given our positionalities and access to power, not everyone could afford to travel and cross the borders. How do you see the possibility of bringing these works to a global audience? And because of time, I just wanted to make sure this is from Devalina Das, the question about crossing borders and bringing your works to a global audience. But I want to make sure that the question of Leila Hijab is not lost, which is how can we address alienated youth still under their parents' roof, but estranged from all? I think these are both questions about, reaching out to either the youth or bringing other works in other languages to each other.
So
either one.
The first question is it's how to make visible the languages from the South. Is that was a
Yes, from all of these languages that are not recognized in the canon, there's still a lot of regional works, regional languages, I guess, that don't have access to these global audiences.
Okay. Do you want to take one and I take, or do you want to,
Why don't you to that one, Natalie? Because, that's so much of what you do and so much of your work.
I think it's so vital. To bring the languages that are not that are unknown. We continue to work. When I started working 20 years ago, there was hardly anything in translation, for example, or all the languages that the person that asked the questions. There are so many. There was less than 3% of literature in translations, for example. And then there's all the languages that you're speaking about that hasn't been brought into, let's say, an educational space and a mainstream space. And we have changed a lot in that in classes, new departments have been created. And as educators, all of us, when we are teaching, it's so important to integrate these works and to teach these works so that a new generation is aware of these works. So I think as educators in universities, we do that. As anthologists, we do that. As editors, as guest editors in magazines, as people connected with other writers, how we come together to bring those unnamed voices. I work with Words Without Borders, which is a very important space for work in translations and work that are of languages that are not as known. I work constantly in different spaces to bring that, and I know many others, I'm sure you do too, right, that do that. So we continue to do that, and there's a long way to go, but I think we all participate in our way, and we have to continue. It's vital. It's very important until we can have all these voices known, until we are aware of the great landscape of stories, minds, histories. We are really not where we need to be, and we will not be able to advance the way we are supposed to advance without all these voices. The only way to advance forward is that all of us march forward together.
Sheldra?
Maybe you want to say something about the youth.
That needs to be said. She just broke down the work of decolonization.
Yes, and we actually did want to talk about translation earlier, and the importance of translation, as feminist work, translating across cultures, translating across languages. And I myself have also tried to do little translations in the work to bring some things to English audiences. But we're almost about time. Does anybody want to speak about the youth? I think that's a question of translation too. I mean, age and youth culture. Yes.
It's so important to youth. We have to get to the youth. This is a very important work. I can't remember exactly the question, but getting to the youth is essential. It really is. And I don't know if we have time. Thank you to the person who asked that question, because without our youth, without educating our youth in the way and giving them that roadmap for how they should see the world, that's where it starts, really, and so education at that level is really quite essential. And yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in some ways, both of you have addressed the question, because it's about alienated youth who are still under their parents' roof, but estranged from all. And I think even your remarks, Nathalie, on creating your own authenticity, I think is some form of is very encouraging, I think.
Yeah. People. This is sorry, I had forgotten how to encourage. Not easy, but to think if those who feel that they don't have the power, I think I don't know. These are difficult questions. What are their circumstances, right? I remember being in Kabul in Afghanistan, and I worked with women and girls in these poetry workshops, and to see some of these young girls and women risk their lives just to write a poem. That was one of the greatest acts of strength to experience that. So we are present in our voices, and we hope that these voices can reach them. And we are open, I think, for them to know that if they need to reach us, we are there to connect with them.
On that note, I think you read in the chat the many thanks that are coming in. I want to thank you, Nathalie and Sheldra, for this amazing conversation, and thank you so much for your work and for your words and for the power of your words. So thank you to the organizers. Thank you Thanks everybody, to the audience for being here.
Thank you.
Salamat. Maraming salamat. Thank you.